Hello and welcome back to part 1 in a new series of videos where I'm going to be looking at Synology and QNAP. Now, I've compared these two devices before. I've compared different model IDs. I've even compared their respective softwares in DSM and QTS, something I will be revisiting on a bigger scale later in 2023. But this first part in this series is about more specific things. Each one of these videos is going to be targeting something about the general utility of these devices. Now, this first video is going to be about the first time setup. We're going to be comparing what options are available and the simplicity of setting both of these devices up. We're going to be setting up the Synology there, installing our firmware, in setting up the device for the first time and enabling our RAID configuration. And then we're going to do exactly the same thing on the QNAP. We're going to try to do as much of it side by side as possible, screen size permitting, and hopefully by the end of this video you'll understand which one of these is a lot easier for you to set up, which one is more configurable to your needs, and what storage options are available when you set the device up for the first time. Later videos are going to be looking at individual apps and how they compare, as well as different utilities when it comes to recovering the device. What happens when you have a power failure? What happens when you have a RAID failure? So if you've got a very specific instance where you want to see how these two brands react to a given instance or a different kind of intended consequence, and how they compare to help you decide which one's going to be better for you and your needs long term, let me know in the comments. But for now, let's make our way over to the first time setup of these devices on the software level. It's worth highlighting, I'm not going to show you how to install the drives, as it's really simple. Both of them arrive with click and load drives, and again, both of these devices can run with as little as one drive inside if you choose. For my instance though, I am going to be using multiple drives, and I'll be using different NASs throughout the video, and if there's any distinct differences that are specific to any one NAS, I will let you know. But for now, let's make our way over to my laptop and start the initialization of both of these devices and what they compare in terms of the utilities that are given to you, the client applications, and their overall setup first time. Let's go. Okay, so here we are on the desktop of my PC. We've logged in with the web browser there and we set the device up. And as you can see on the right hand side of the screen is the QNAP setup, and the left hand side of the screen is the Synology setup. But how did I get to this point? Well, this is probably a very good point to highlight once again. This is about comparing how these two brands kind of initialize their system, what options are open to you, what elements of configuration are available. So if you're watching this video because you've already bought a NAS and you don't know how to set it up, I strongly recommend you check out my multi-part series of guides that I've already made on both of these two NAS brands. I made a 2022 version and it goes through everything from setting up your individual files and folders to your storage, your RAID, your multimedia, synchronization, backups, network, the works. I'll try to link to these in the description, but if you've come to this video looking for setup guides, go to those two playlists. They cover everything you're going to need. But in order to find the NAS on your network, the first thing we're going to need to do is head to the download center from both Synology and QNAP respectively. When you go to their own pages and you put in the name of your NAS, you'll get a list of different downloads available to you. And the one you're looking for, and the first thing we're going to compare with both of these brands, is their client tool for Windows and Mac. Now, this is the tool that you're going to be utilizing in order to find the NAS on your network. You can use third-party tools to scan your network if you choose, such as Advanced IP Scanner, but both brands bring out their own tool that the first thing we want to compare between the two of them. Unfortunately, I can't shrink that QNAP one anymore. Now, this is what you use to scan your local area network, and as long as the NAS is connected to the same network, that is to say, connected to the same router or switch that your client machine, your Windows or your Mac is using, it will appear here. And I would say, between the two of them, it will come as no surprise that the QNAP tool is a lot more diverse in what it can do. If we look at the Synology one there, if we look at a preset NAS, you can see there's our NAS there at the bottom that's not set up yet. And from here, we can search the local area network, we can connect directly with that device. And what we can also do is if we select it, we can right click. And again, we can go for those same options if we're using Wake on LAN. That's something for a later video where you can wake up a NAS from sleep remotely. You can use it there. Indeed, if you go into the settings here, you can go go ahead and enable memory testing as well. Do bear in mind some options won't appear unless the NAS is fully initialized. So for example, look at this one, we can do a memory test to check and stress that memory to see if it's functioning correctly and stuff like that. We can even map the network drive, something we'll cover in part 2 of this series where we look at more advanced storage setup and how they compare on these two brands. But that's really it for the assistant tool from Synology. And on the QNAP tool, you won't be surprised that it's a lot more fully featured. So for example, when we're looking at these two NASes here, obviously we have this NAS here at the bottom that is yet to be set up, the one we're going to be utilizing today. But once we go to this NAS here at the top that's already set up, again, we can access it directly if we choose to see all the remote accessible drives. And again, we will have to put in our login credentials. And then from there, we'll be able to log straight into the device, as I remember that I have not put the right password in there. So at least it's not letting me go straight in there. We'll come back to that later on because I've forgotten the login of that NAS and I use I've got a lot of randomized stuff there. But from there, you can access all the individual drives, which we'll cover in part 2. You can also directly upload media onto a specific NAS, but once again, you will have to put in those credentials. You can also configure the NAS without logging in via the user interface there. So you can just go through and configure things like the network, the individual storage configurations there. Let's try that as a password there. And again, once you go into the device this way, you can change a lot of things. You can change the password, change a lot of the dates, but more importantly, you can change the network settings. So if you're having difficulty getting into a device because you set it as a fixed IP rather than a dynamic IP, and you don't want to go to the trouble of resetting the box via the reset pin on the back, you can change that IP from within this. It's one of the small things that really makes things even better. And if you do enable code level access, you can even go in to code level pages there. Also from there, you can access the resource monitor on a given NAS, so you can find out more information about it without fully logging in via the graphical user interface, find out more information about it, locate it on the network with a beep, and stuff like that. And again, Wake on LAN is of course supported too. So it lacks the memory testing, although I would argue there are still lots of other tools built into the QNAP one that more than make up for it. So overall, I would say that in terms of the assistant tool to find the NAS on your network and interact with it the first time, the tool is definitely better on the QNAP there. Now, when we do use that tool, and again, you would download that tool directly from using the utility section on either website there for either platform to get the right tools. And of course, there are lots of different utilities. We're not going to cover all of them in this video. We're not going to cover all of them in this series of videos. I will say that there are more tools on the QNAP side, but I would argue there are probably more, the design is slightly better on the Synology ones in terms of usability there. But again, more on that in future videos. But using either of those two tools is where we find our NAS here on the network. Which brings us into how these two devices compare during setup. As you can see, the identity of these two NASs, we've got this one on IP 137 up there, and you can double click that if you choose and it'll open up that tab, but I've already opened it. Same goes IP 105 up there. So this is what we see on either of these screens. So I'm going to guide you through the first initialization of this device when it gets its software ready. So let's start on the Synology side, shall we? So from here, you can find out a bit of information about the device if you choose, but go ahead and click install. Then you'll be given the option whether you want to automatically download the very latest version of DSM available from the Synology website, or manually download it if you want a specific firmware, or that the firmware you've got maybe is a beta or a later version. Again, you can go straight to that download page we mentioned earlier on, and you can download that latest version there or go to older versions there. I would always recommend generally going for the automatic installation of the latest firmware there. And you can go ahead, click next. It will let you know that if there is data on those drives, it will delete them. Bear in mind, if this system recognized that there was Synology data on those drives, it would recognize it's Synology data, and before allowing you to put the firmware on it, it will ask you if you want to migrate the data. Both of these NASs do provide that service, but I am using blank drives today. Also bear in mind that with both of these systems, if you are utilizing drives from another system, say another NAS brand, or even a private TrueNAS server, you can't carry that data over. The ext formatting and the Linux operating system both of these NASs use is completely different, and it will need to reorganize the system. Ergo, data on those drives is going to go. But for now, on the Synology side, we can go ahead and there you go. How many clicks was that? 3, 4 at a push? That's how many clicks it was. So now let's go to the QNAP side of things to do our initialization. So we click Smart Initialization there, and once again, it will ask us, do we want to use the current version that is installed on the NAS, because these systems have the firmware on board? Do we want to check if a newer version has become available, which I don't believe it is, as it says the latest version is up to date? Or once again, you can upload an independent version by going into QNAP's own website once again, going to the operating system tab, and you can download the latest version of the software there. So there's lots of stuff for you to play with and lots of options. But once again, we're going to go for current version that's on there, so we're not going to download the software. We're just going to use the existing firmware that's on board the system. But this time it asks us to set up the system first. So that's our first big difference. The Synology is going to ask us to do that later. So we first name our NAS. So I'm going to call this one the NAS that I am using for this test. I know it's not the same NAS from the intro. We are then going to give ourselves a username. Bear in mind on the QNAP side, the admin account is disabled by default. So I'm going to go for a Moody admin account there. It's not the same as a traditional admin. And then you have to give yourself a password. Once again, try to keep it as strong as you can, but that really is up to you. We will be talking a little bit more about two-step authentication later on and the necessity of that. So we click Next. From there, we have to set up our time zone, which is going to be very, very important for if you're using online services or if you're going to let the NAS connect to the internet. Bear in mind that the majority of the things I'm going to show you today do not need your NAS to be connected to the internet, but you will need a PC sometimes to download that firmware if it's a newer version. Again, you can set it manually or let it stay at automatic if you choose. Next, automatic or dynamic IPs. A dynamic IP is the device, if it's powered down, powered on, your switch turns on, your router, that changes its identity on the network. It can be more fluid, whereas a fixed IP is better for performance and rigidity of having active connections with the device, where you can't really afford to have a device that changes its location on the network, but that also enhances the performance. So bear in mind, again, if you lose track of what that IP is, you're going to have to scan the network and re-find it or reset. I'm going to leave it as dynamic for now. So there you go. There are our settings. So for now, I'm going to click Apply. It will once again warn us the drives will be initialized, and it will initialize our QNAP NAS system there in the background. Now, we're not going to time these things. We're not going to say which one's quicker. First and foremost, these are very different NASes. We've got one NAS that's got a Ryzen processor with 4 gig of ECC memory, and we've got another NAS that's running on a dual-core Intel with 2 gig of memory. So we're not going to compare them. Also bear in mind that the QNAP on that side, it's not had to download firmware because it's got the latest firmware on board. Whereas in the case of the Synology, it's had to download that new firmware and install it. So although we're not going to compare these two in terms of the speed of how they're set up there, we will highlight that the QNAP seemingly asked us a few extra questions there during the setup in a way the Synology didn't. I believe the Synology will start as a dynamic IP. You may have heard the beep. And there we go. It's now installing some of the default packages of the system. You are going to see some of these notes here on the QNAP side, because although the majority of applications on either one of these two brands is optional, some applications are not. Some basic standard applications, from everything from storage management and snapshots to running iSCSI targets, file management and multimedia servers and more. So do bear that in mind. But for now, what I'm going to do is fast forward to when both of these NASs have completed the first stage of initialization, and I can walk you through the next step in their individual setup. Okay, so now the QNAP has finished the first stage of its initialization. Let's make our way back to the Synology to see which extra options are now being added after that. So when we click that, now we can name our device. So I'm going to go ahead and call it this. Actually, no, I believe it's the 923. Why not? Let's mix it up and be correct. From there, we can also create that, again, this admin power account, but it won't be the full admin account there because that will be disabled by default. So we enter our password. And then from there, we can choose whether we want the NAS to be visible via that assistant. I would say yes, but do bear in mind, again, a lot of that is going to do with the external access as well. So choose what you think is more appropriate to do. Still, not too much information being thrown at you. From here, it will ask you what to do about updates. Again, this is something I'm very surprised we didn't see a lot earlier there on the QNAP. What happens with the updates to our firmware and individual applications? Do we want the system to automatically run updates as soon as an update becomes available, to do with both apps and DSM? Or do you only want key important updates, or all of them to be manual? So if you want to stay really secure, make sure all updates are installed, the biggest ones, but again, you can go for the latest ones if you choose. So it's up to you. Personally, I would definitely go for the most important updates to be installed. Something I'm very surprised wasn't on the QNAP side there, particularly given events of early 2022. I think it would have been nice if they'd actually said early doors what you want to do about updates there. But again, you will see some other splash screens very soon that have been added to QNAP 5.01, which may remedy that. Next up, creating external access. It's worth highlighting, again, we will cover this in a lot more detail in our access and sync, I believe in part 3 or 4, when we compare these two devices. But from here, you can create your Synology account. And there's a whole range of benefits utilizing your Synology account with your system, your configuration, as well as localized access there and remote access differences. So you can choose to set up with that, but I'm going to leave that till later on for now, because I don't think you should go about setting up the network remote access to your device until you've got it set up perfectly for yourself. And as it says, you can carry on creating it now or do it later. Then it will ask you if you want to share information with regards to analytics with Synology. If it is internet connected, bear in mind once again that this is going to be analytical data, not your actual data. So I'll let you decide what you want to do there. And there you go, it submits all of those choices, and now we are in DSM. And the first thing it's asking us right now is setting up that storage, but we'll come to that later on because we're going to make our way back to that QNAP there. Now on the QNAP, we've done that first stage of initialization, so now we go into NAS management, and it's going to ask us to log in there. So again, we've already created that information earlier on, so we can log right in. And again, we can choose whether we want it to save it, to go for our secure login there where it's encrypted. Lovely little option there, and you'll need to log in with the HTTPS login there if you choose to. But I've not set up the remote access on this yet, so I'm not going to do any of that at this time. But again, you can do that based on your preferences. Again, as you can see, QNAP is saying that it is going to use some of the analytical data, but again, not the choice. Early doors there. So you can choose whether you want to do it, but unfortunately it looks like they're going to need that analytical data. So a number of you who are going to have this internet connected may not be wholly on board with that, and it's nice to have at least a choice with the usage of that analytical data there. So well, you notice the difference immediately between the two of them when we get to our login screen is the Synology has asked us about creating storage, and we can ignore that if we choose and just move forward, which would be silly, but at least it's there, and we can go via the normal configuration option and do everything that we want to do. The QNAP, the first thing it does is it grays stuff out and just highlights what certain features are. Now, I know the text looks very small, but do bear in mind I have squeezed these into half a screen each. If we were to zoom in a little bit and go to 100%, we'd see slightly more. But as you can see, it's already offering us quite, arguably too much information at once. Because it's asking you about setting up your storage for the first time, the same as the Synology, but it's done it a little bit more of an aggressive way there. And again, these are steps that it can recommend you do while it tells you what the device can do. And again, arguably in terms of features and functionality, the QNAP can do a lot more. But the way it's presented at you is a lot louder and a lot shoutier there. And again, you can click new storage pool and you'll do exactly what this is going to show us here. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to move into our next step where we're going to set up our areas of storage. So setting up our storage, we're going to start with the Synology side first. Once again, bear in mind, these screens are all getting squeezed in here to keep everything on screen. You normally have a lot more space to play with there. So if we go to the Synology one first, we can either click Create Now, or if we chose to, we could have gone to the boxes here at the top and just selected that storage manager there. But for now, we're going to go ahead and click Create Now. This opens up our storage creation wizard. And again, it's going to be a lot more hand-holdy on the Synology side. So first thing we need to do is select our RAID configuration. So both of these have very similar RAIDs, but the Synology has one extra little option which some of you are going to like, and that is SHR, Synology Hybrid RAID. So on the Synology side of things, when it comes to creating your RAID, you can go for standard things like RAID 0, which combines it all. You can go for a JBOD, which just keeps the drives loose. You can go for a basic, where the drives again are loose with no kind of mapped or kind of architecture matching the drives together. Go for a RAID 1, for example, if you have at least 2 drives, so that both drives are being read and written to the same data and thereby identical. Or you can go for a RAID 5, where it combines all the data together, and with all of the drives, every wave of data that is written down to the very smallest blocks is written across the drives, but one drive is given a blueprint of all the other data, and every time it writes over, that blueprint hops around onto each of the drives. Thereby, if you lose one drive, your data can still be recovered. What sets SHR apart from all of that is with SHR, it allows you to mix and match bigger and smaller drives, and that is something that's not available on the QNAP side there. What SHR does is, if you were to, for example, this is a 4-bay NAS and I put 3 drives in, if later down the line I put another drive, I can put any drive I want and the system will do its best to absorb any bigger drive sizes that go in. You need to include more drives to take advantage of that, but it's effectively Synology's own alternative to a RAID 5, whereas a RAID 5 won't give you the ability to mix and match drives. This will. So we're going to go ahead there and go with an SHR. It's also worth highlighting there was a RAID 6 option if I had one more drive, but again we can give the pool a description if we want, so we're just going to call it HDD SHR. We click next. From there we select the drives we want to use, so I'm going to go with all of the drives there. From there we're going to click next. It will then highlight that the drives in those bays are not on the supported list, and this brings us to another difference between these two brands that some of you may not be overly keen on, and that is that their respective brands have very different positions on compatibility of first and third party storage. Now, and this goes to other components as well. So Synology have their own range of hard drives and SSDs and stuff like that, and the result is that they tend to prioritize their own storage media in SSDs, even in memory and PCIe upgrades. Now, it doesn't mean you can't use them, but if the drives that you use do not feature on the official compatibility list of the system you are using, the result is that you are using the system in a way that Synology have not stated they have built it for, and it may impinge upon the way they can support you if you are using it in a configuration with which they have never or are unable to replicate in the event of a problem. Now, there is lots of mixed feelings about this online, it should be said, and the drives I've got inside this Synology today are WD Ultrastar 10 TBs, which I know for a fact work in this system. I've been using them here on the channel for years. So I'm very surprised they're not on the official compatibility list of this device. But as you can see, if we go to the compatibility listings, it will open in a brand new tab for us, and from there it will give us more information about which drives are compatible with this system. Ignore the fact that it's gone to the Taiwanese page. That's because I was recently using the Taiwanese page to look at some different resources for something else. And as you can see, if we go to the brand in question and we select Western Digital, because Western Digital Ultrastar, and we go down and we can see Ultrastar is not on this list, despite the fact that it does appear on some other enterprise Synology NAS lists. So this may annoy some of you, but we're going to have to proceed. But the system on several occasions will highlight to us that we're using uncompatible or non-supported and non-verified drives. So next thing you want to do is decide how much of this pool you want to utilize as a volume. Now, a volume is that the drives you create are combined together in a RAID known as a storage pool. This is the base and all of the storage at your disposal. On top of that, you create one or more containers known as volumes. So if you want to create one separate area for all of your multimedia, your TV, your movies, your photos, create a smaller volume there. You can create an additional volume if you wanted to for surveillance, another volume for backups. And that's why you have volumes on top of storage pools. So from here, while you're creating your storage pool, you can create an additional volume there, which is that lovely little container. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to maximum. The reason I'm doing that is rather than create multiple pools, I want to keep things as even as possible across both of these two devices. So we're going to create that pool, and we're going to call this one the SHR HDD pool. We go for there, click next. Next it will ask us, do we want BTRFS and EXT? Another big difference between these two brands. because on the Synology side, they support ext4, which is a much older and arguably well-established storage file system. Synology also include the BTRFS platform there. Now, the advantages of BTRFS are things like much easier background snapshot creation. They also include shared folder recreation near instantaneously, lower resource consumption and lower resource consumption during snapshot replication, and more efficient snapshot creation space acquisition. Finally, there is the advantages of file self-healing, much like ECC memory, which is when if there are inconsistencies observed during write operations as data is passed through the BTRFS checks, then it will repair that file to the original write format of that data thanks to parity. The majority of Synology's applications, in fact, insist on you using a BTRFS file system. Some things like virtual machines using Synology's own apps will not allow you to use non-BTRFS as a file system of the storage areas of choice. So do bear that in mind. In most cases, you kind of have to use BTRFS. Moving forward, you click that and then click apply. It will delete that data, and it will now create our brand new storage pool and volume. Now, the amount of time that will take does differ wildly on the size of the drive you use, as well as the speed of the drives you use and the number of drives you use. In our advanced storage series, we will talk a lot about expanding our RAID, something we'll do later on. But for now, we're going to leave the Synology side of things as it begins to build our storage area there and move over to the QNAP side. Now, on the QNAP side, again, we can go ahead and click the storage pool icon if we want, or we can go ahead and go straight into the storage manager if we choose. For me, I'm going to go into the new storage pool. Now, this will allow us to create our storage pool. And again, unsurprising, there are way more configuration choices for the QNAP side of things. Now, for a start, immediately, as mentioned earlier on, there is the business of volumes living on top of the storage pool. Now, with things living on the storage pool, as you can see, there are the drives, there's the storage pool and the volumes. They also highlight this, Q tier. Now, Q tier allows you to create a pool of not only hard drives, but SSDs. So you could combine an area of hard drives and SSDs into one intelligent pool. And this pool then over time learns what is the more frequently accessed and therefore more important data and moves it over to the SSD area within the giant pool. That pool made up of multiple drives, it knows which areas are the fastest. Now, I know that sounds a lot like caching, something we'll talk about either later in this video or the next video, but this isn't the same thing. Whereas caching duplicates data and either keeps a duplicated copy of the data to be frequently accessed or for writing reasons, when it comes to Q tier, it doesn't copy, it moves the data from the slower hard drives onto the SSDs. This is something we'll touch on in a later video. For now, as you can see, it's recognized that we have 3 hard drives inside here and 2 SSDs. Now, we're going to ignore the SSDs for now, but we will be coming back to those SSDs later. But for now, we select the drives we want to use. So we select our 3 drives. And as you can see, we've got our configurations. Now, we don't have that fluid RAID option. We can go for a RAID 0 or a RAID 5 there. So for now, I'm going to select a RAID 5. It's also worth highlighting that it gives you the option, if you have a disk available, to create a hot spare. A hot spare is when you have an idle drive in the system that's on, kind of like a warm drive, that just sits there. And then if one of the drives in your primary storage array collapses, fails, or breaks for any reason, it will automatically swap that drive out for the hot spare drive. Therefore, if you are away from the NAS and you have a hard drive fault, it saves you having to be there on site to replace the drive. That's the reason you'd have a hot spare. Now, I can't enable that today because I've only got the 3 drives in here, and later on we're going to expand that storage, but it's nice to have the option. Next, we've got a lot more configuration options to talk about here. For a start, alerts. Do you want the system to alert you when your storage is getting too full? Now, again, I'm not going to enable that because I'm going to be doing lots of different playing with storage areas and pools and volumes. But if you want the system to let you know when your storage is starting to run out, you can enable that. The same thing goes for snapshots. Whereas on the Synology side, you can set up a snapshot routine to take snapshot images of shared folders and more. What you can do on the QNAP side is more extensive snapshots, but you can also set up the rules for snapshots right away, right at the beginning if you choose, something that a lot of you will appreciate. Yes, you can do that on this side by installing some of the apps and going into the snapshot area, but it's quite nice that QNAP arrived with that at the beginning. It just may be a little bit intimidating for some of you. For me, I'm going to enable 10% of the storage to be guaranteed for snapshot space. That means that 10% of that pool will not be usable because it will be dedicated and reserved for those snapshots. Next up, you can see, make sure I didn't skip a page by accident. No, we didn't. There is our storage pool ready to go. It sounds a little bit more complex, doesn't it? Because there's a few more options to play with, but still nonetheless, there's still plenty of things we can be doing there. And if we make our way back while we look at the different options, it was very straightforward, the things that we did once you actually know what you're doing. And then we're going to go ahead and create our storage pool. So we've created our pools. What do we want to do next? Well, obviously, we want to start creating those volumes. The first, I say the most recent thing you may have noticed is things just take just a little bit longer on the QNAP side. Yes, I've had to explain every step that I've gone through during the course of this video to guide you through it, but there's still no denying that because of the larger amount of configuration options on the QNAP side, things just seem to take that little bit longer to go through all of the steps, whereas the Synology pares down a lot of the setup options, and then later on, if you want to start chopping and changing certain things, then you can do those afterwards. So again, it's a different position there, definitely in terms of user-friendly and complexity. Now what we're going to do is fast forward a little bit, because that QNAP, as it's got just a dual-core Intel and 2 gig of memory, it's going to take a little bit longer to initialize that storage. That's nothing to do with the QNAP versus Synology debate here. That's just because we're using a much more powerful Synology that I only had available in the studio rather than the QNAP. Let's fast forward to the completion of the initialization of the storage pool on a QNAP. It's worth highlighting at this point that during the course of that storage build-up, I noticed that behind the other windows, there actually was an option to choose whether to collect the data or not, the analytical data by QNAP there. So you can choose to say no to that option. I still think it would have been nicer to have that pop up earlier on during the initialization, thereby at least highlighting that so people wouldn't make the same mistake. But still, nonetheless, at least it's an option there to say no to that analytical data being shared. Now, carrying on a QNAP side there, in order to create the volume, what we do is go up here and then select New Volume. This will allow us to create our new volume on top of that storage pool we created. And once again, there's a lot more configuration options here, which may be to your taste or you may find quite intimidating. For example, it will ask you to choose different kinds of storage volume there, which will change things in terms of performance, change things in terms of expandability of adding drives. Again, lots of different options there. Indeed, in terms of space management, as you can see, of the ability to create multiple containers, it's recommended to go for a thin volume, whereas a pre-configured storage volume using a thick volume, which again allows you to add more drives later within a predetermined size. Finally, traditional ones that do not support additional RAID features is possible with a static volume. So again, I wouldn't really recommend that third one unless you know what you're going to be doing and using third-party software. But still, it's nice to have that extra information. And indeed, you can click the detailed comparison and it will go through the advantages of each. There's a lot of information, but I don't think anyone can say to QNAP that they don't at the very least provide enough information on the differences between them there. So for me, just to keep things nice and easy, I'm going to go ahead with the recommended on-demand volume there. Again, we select if we have multiple storage pools, which one we're going to use, or we can go ahead and create a new one if we choose to go back to the previous page. Click Next. From there, it will say that we need to monitor it, and as the space grows, so do make sure that you've got enough space and you are thinking long term. Again, could have selected the other options, but I'm going to go with the default ones there for the system. Next up, we're going to look at that creation of it. First, we have to give it an identity. So again, we're going to call it RAID 5 HDD vol. From there, we then say how much space we want to use, because remember, some of that space has been allocated, and we can either go to full capacity, or again, we could have gone for a smaller volume, so we could have multiple volumes if we choose there. Again, if you're going to go with Snapshot, save a little bit more. So for my case, I'm just going to put this at 20 TB there. Then you can choose whether you want to encrypt the volume. Now, this is something that is available right now on the QNAP platform, and is hopefully coming quite soon on the Synology platform. The ability for whole volume encryption there. Something that, again, has been high demanded for a long time, and Synology have yet to roll out. When DSM 7.2 arrives, it will be a beta, and maybe you're watching this halfway, maybe 2/3 of the way through 2023, and you have that feature, but you can choose if you wish to encrypt the whole volume there, which will then generate a key. Again, I'm not going to do that, just to keep things on this system side by side. You can even change the alert threshold on the volume, not just the overall storage pool, if you choose, to get alerts when that volume is running out of space. You can even change the size of the block sizes within that volume very easily. I'm going to leave it as default. It does make kind of an analysis based on the storage values you choose, but it's still nice to have that level of configuration, but it may slow people down that don't know quite what they're doing. Finally, again, snapshots. Do you want to maintain that snapshots there and have that allocated space that we mentioned earlier on? Of course, I'm going to say yes. And then finally, we create our volume. So as you can see, when we are setting up our areas of storage pools and volumes, things are certainly more layered on the QNAP side, and they certainly take a bit more time. But it has to be said that at least you've got those options to configure those things on the fly. Whereas on the Synology side, although you do have those options, I would argue those options are things you do later, and some users may not even know they can do those things. So it comes down to you, the user, knowing what you want and how you want to have it done. Let's move on. Next up, we're going to compare how this system kind of allows you to monitor and check upon, or maybe even run health checks on the individual drives on their respective NAS platforms. Let's make our way back to the Synology there. There we've got the image of our NAS there on screen. From here, we can choose to overview the storage pool that we created earlier on, and we can monitor the individual volume if we choose there at the bottom. Finally, we can look at the individual drives there on the bottom tab. So again, nice, straightforward, simple options there, very, very clear to the eye. Now, if you want to dig a little deeper, for example, select an individual drive. From there, you can find out more health information about the drive that may have been garnered from things like SMART, or if you're using Seagate drives, Seagate's Iron Wolf Health Management there. And you can run individual tests if you choose, and run them on a schedule if you like, by digging in there. Finally, you can locate the drive via the LEDs on the front of the system, or you can choose to run a benchmark on that drive to find out how fast it's running. Alternatively, you can secure erase, which will delete the drive bit by bit, as well as deactivating the drive from the pool if you wish, which may destabilize your RAID if you do that wrong. Or you can configure the write caching on the drive if it has the facility for that, to have enhanced write cache. The same goes if you go into the storage pool area. You can change a lot of those individual settings. For example, you can set up that hot spare that we talked about earlier on. It was in the early stages of the QNAP setup guide there. Alternatively, you can run a schedule for when you want the drives to be scrubbed periodically to keep the drives in the block size and everything together in tip-top shape there. Finally, you can go into the global settings if you choose for broader settings that affect the whole system. So for example, you can do space reclamation, which is effectively defragmentation, where as you write data to the disk and delete it, there's certain gaps. What space reclamation does is just go through the drive and move all the data closer to the center of each disk, and therefore makes data access a lot faster by removing all of the gaps that may have occurred during the deletions. Next up, you can change the RAID rebuild speed to, in this case, we're going to increase that so our RAID from earlier is built a lot faster. And finally, fast repair. This is something QNAP doesn't have, much like SHR, which is a really cool feature that I don't think gets enough attention. And with fast repair, what it does is if one of your drives dies and you install a new drive, or you use a hot spare to repair your RAID, what will happen is with fast repair enabled, it will only repair the data. So as you have your drives, you might have, in this case, 3 10 TB drives. So 30 TB or technically 20 TB on one drive of recovery. And you might have only 2 terabytes on there. A traditional RAID needs to build the full scale of all of those drives, even the empty parts of the drive, as it will map out the individual blocks of the drive thanks to the parity from that RAID. Now, Fast Repair will only spend time building where the data is. It will build that 2 TB of data back in the recovery and then just zero out the rest of the drive. It significantly reduces RAID rebuild times. But bear in mind, it's only really advantageous if you or your drives have got a significant amount of space on them to start with. The fuller your drives, the less benefit this will be. But it's still a great option to have. Actually, I should save what I did earlier on there with the fast RAID rebuild. Same goes with the volume, because you can change certain settings of individual volumes if you choose, like the stripe size and the stripe ability. Same goes where we can change some of the utility of our storage pool there via those options. But bear in mind, again, much like the low capacity notification, much like we saw earlier on with guaranteed snapshot space, these are all options that Synology puts later. And QNAP, because it puts them all at the front, it comes across as a great deal more complex and a huge learning curve early doors there. So that's really it in terms of the configuration to all of the storage. Again, in the next part of this video, we will go into a lot more detail on things like SSD caching, read-write caching there, and other advanced storage applications in part 2. But making our way back over to the QNAP side of things, as you can see, there's a lot more to read here. There's a lot on screen. It looks particularly intimidating when it's so squished in like this. So, for example, again, individual drives, you can see the interface there. At the bottom, you've got information about the individual drives. Indeed, if we were to give this more size on the screen, you will see that it's not quite so squeezed up. Unfortunately, that is just not an option here. So for now, let's move it back to the way it was. Pop that there and carry on. So those individual drives, we can choose if we wish to find out, again, disk information there. We can go ahead and find out disk health. Again, Seagate IronWolf Health Management, because these are Seagate drives, we can find out more. Same goes with the smart test. We can run scheduled tests or an individual test if we choose. There's a lot more being put in there, as well as temperature alarms, performing rapid tests, slow tests, deep tests, even the higher IronWolf Health Management there, applied to individual drives or the full drive array if you choose there. Indeed, next, you can go ahead and go for an individual bad block check. So it isn't just a RAID re-scrubbing and stuff like that. You can do more there to find more about it. Finally, you can overview the entire RAID group, which at the moment is synchronizing. More on that later on. And indeed, if we want to run individual performance tests, we can go ahead, click performance test. It lists all of the drives that are in the system, and we can run either, if we choose, normal sequential read-write tests or IOPS tests, as well as doing a scheduled regular test if we choose. Now, moving away from that, looking at the overview of the full storage group, as you can see, it is still resyncing the whole RAID array. And again, that RAID configuration, if we choose, we can speed that up if we wish by changing a lot of the RAID synchronization priorities. As you can see, we've got the RAID group being built and there's utilization and statistics there in the background. We can also upgrade it if we chose with those SSDs using QT I mentioned earlier on, free up space or expand the pool, something we'll touch on in the advanced section of this video series. If we click that cog up there, this is where we can change those RAID groups, as mentioned, change the RAID rebuild speeds if we choose. So right now, we can increase that priority to a much higher speed priority to get the job done, as well as creating that RAID scrubbing schedule as mentioned, auto reclaim, in other words like defragmentation and using SSD trim, and file system checks there in the background regularly. The options are there, they're just presented, I would argue, a little bit more technically and a little bit more intimidatedly by comparison. Intimidatedly, I don't think that's a word. Same goes if you want to manage an individual volume. There are a whole separate section for monitoring the health and the behavior of the volume away from the storage pool there. So there's lots of config tools to play with here, with individual tools being installed on them, and again running all of those tests, resizing the volume if you choose, if you chose the right thick or thin provisioning, and again you can convert one way, not the other. So all of these tools are available, but just bear in mind that some of these options will format the overall array. You're not committed until you start writing data. Everything else here on the side, everything from snapshots here, which again, snapshots being enabled as a default feature, as you can see on the QNAP side, but on the Synology a little bit more installation is required. Now with Snapshot, it's another big glaring difference between these two brands and setting the device up for the first time. Now for those that aren't aware, snapshots are kind of as the name implies. You select areas of storage on your NAS and then periodically the system takes a snapshot. This is kind of a blueprint of the layout of data that's on there. Now snapshots can be taken with quite alarming frequency. These frequent snapshots there create a timeline which allow you, if you want to revert the system back to a previous state, at least as far as the storage is concerned, you can flick through the little timeline of different snapshots to go back to an old one, but you do need to maintain them all. Now both of these brands have different ways of approaching this subject. As you may have seen on the QNAP side there, it does include the option for snapshotting early doors. However, even though the option to create snapshots and the allocation of that space for snapshots is set up at the beginning, you can't run snapshots until the volume has finished optimizing. So for example, if I was to try to set up an area of a snapshotted area of space, unfortunately I can't because the volume is still being created. I can go ahead, it will create default shared folders as well as create another one, something I'll talk about later. But for now, until the volume is completed, of which I'll fast forward to later on, I can't create snapshots quite yet. So when that's done, I believe it's up to 20% optimization, so we'll come back to that later. But on the side of the Synology, things are slightly different. Although we've got that area of storage early doors, snapshots need to be installed separately. And what we need to do is head into the App Center, and there is a tool for snapshots. Just chuck in the word snap there at the top, or search it manually if you choose, and you will find the snapshot replication tool. Now the snapshot replication tool, it's easy to install. It will have to install a small add-on as well, but you will need that internet connection, or at least download it from the list of available applications from Synology in order to take advantage of it. Once it's installed, click open. Now this brings us to another area of difference between these two systems, and that is to do with the shared folder creation. Both of these platforms allow you to create shared folders. As you can see, I've created a test shared folder here. And if we look at the QNAP and we go to its own file folder manager there, we'll see that I've created that folder there, the share test. But on the QNAP side, it actually creates some hierarchical folders at the beginning, which can all be set. But in the case of the Synology, until you start installing applications, you'll have to make your own shared folders, something I'll talk about right after the snapshots area. But for now we've got a folder there which may have a bunch of data in it that we've created within the file management area there. Nice and easily, we've created that folder. We can go ahead and create snapshots. Now creating snapshots, we can go ahead and create a manual snapshot. So if we want to take a snapshot of this point in time of the layout of our storage, we can go ahead and do it there. Or if we've already created a range of snapshots, we can go for them there. It's quite intuitive. The same goes if we created a more advanced area of storage known as a LUN using iSCSI targeting as well. That's again something we're going to talk about in the advanced chapter. But from here, what we can do is click settings. From there, enable a snapshot schedule. Say if we want it to happen daily, weekly, monthly, or what days of the week we'd like it to run. Apologies for the break in recording there. My battery in my laptop was starting to run out. From there, we can say how we want that frequency to take place. Is it every day, every few hours or more? And we can set that snapshot up. So say we go for every single day. We want it frequency of every 1 hour if we choose, starting for the very first time, let's say given the time of day here at 12 o'clock. Then we can change our retention policy, and the retention policy is one, how many snapshots do we want to take, and then if we reach that limit, say 120 snapshots, on the 121st snapshot it will overwrite the oldest one, so it will keep that full range of snapshots at 1 hour. That means 120 hours if we choose. So I'm going to go with that retention policy there, and we can say how long we keep snapshots for generally and more. Finally, the more advanced ones, how we want to name them and date them, or do we want snapshots to be visible in the snapshots folder? And what that means is it gives us the ability to browse through them. But do bear in mind that does take a little bit more system resources and it won't work for encrypted ones. So again, we can click OK, and now our system will start generating snapshots there. So again, every hour, starting from 12 midday, it will start creating those snapshots. And if we choose, we can go ahead and just create our first one, test one there, and we can lock that as our default level snapshot. But just remember, snapshots are chronological. You can't just remove one, because if you do that, all the snapshots older than it cease to work. It's as simple as that. So although it's an optional service, and it's nice to have it there, arguably Synology does do it in a very straightforward and easy way. On top of that, you've got replication, which allows you to select where you want your snapshots to be replicated to, so you can choose if you wish to go for a remote area to send snapshots to. Although that is available on the QNAP side of things, it's not quite as user-friendly there on the Synology. We can create another shared folder for it there for the replication task and create multiple of them, but this is somewhere I think later on we'll talk about in the QNAP where it has the home field advantage. And of course the recovery area there is where we can choose to cycle through our images and find out what the changes are and how we change back. Overall, a very straightforward setup there. But as you can see, we've got our replication, we've got it all set up good to go, and it will start off in just an hour or so. Now on the QNAP side, as you can see, we can have a little look. And unfortunately, we're still looking at optimization. So I'm going to have to fast forward this video to the completion of that volume optimization to show you how it handles snapshots. Now, as you can see, with the completion of a storage volume, because we enabled snapshots during our original setup of both the pools and the volumes there, we've automatically got those snapshots already created, something that I'm very surprised isn't on the Synology side of things. Now, we can dig quite deep into that. We can go in there and find out where it's being maintained. We can create individual ones as well as set up that snapshot schedule if we choose, just like we saw on the Synology there. Again, the repetition of those, the retention policies, whether you want to go for smart snapshots, this is when the system will do a snapshot during the installation of things or big changes to the system rather than relying on a schedule. And indeed, you can change that guaranteed pool space if you choose, as well as changing that retention policy and how and when snapshots are overwritten. So again, as you can see, it will do a whole system snapshot there of the whole volume if you choose, rather than selecting individual files and folders. Again, as you add more and more supported snapshots on the Synology side, if we go in, they will all be covered one by one. But I quite like the fact that the snapshot creation is done right there very early doors. And again, the timeline is there on screen, and you can flick between these different timelines to see how they compare if you want to go into specific files and folders. Very intriguing. And again, you can open them up individually if you choose in File Station to see them natively. That is a feature I'm really surprised isn't so readily available on the Synology. Very similar is available if you want to go into the timeline of some of these snapshots, and you can find out more. But this is one of those occasions when QNAP arguably have done it just a little bit better. And whether you want to clone one of these snapshots, so if you wish you can then send it elsewhere, that's another thing you can do, such as with utilizing snapshot replication, which will allow you to send snapshots to another volume or to another remote NAS. So in the event of your NAS crashing out, with those snapshot images, you can revert, but you will need to make sure the NAS is still in a restorable fashion, the primary NAS. Same goes if you want to go in reverse and you want to set your QNAP NAS as the target for snapshots from elsewhere. These things can be set up quite easily, and creating that replication job to send those snapshots to multiple locations allows you to kind of explore restoration methods. And if you want to test out certain things and roll back, you can do a lot of stuff then. That's something that, although snapshot restoration and third-party sending is possible, I would argue it's not done quite as well on the as you can see with remote and local restoration is possible on the Synology, but I don't think it's done quite as good. I really don't. I think right there you would have to create either within the volume, or when you do a remote NAS, you don't have the same level of control as you do on the QNAP. And it's one of those areas where I would say when it comes to your backups and keeping them as firm and as rigid and as reliable as possible, I would rather have it too complex than not complex enough. So other than that, we'll move away from snapshots there and start talking a little bit more about the traditional storage. Next up, let's talk about setting the device up right in terms of your network and internal password security straight away on day one. Now, both of these platforms do arrive with tools that you can scan your whole system to not only check where vulnerabilities can happen, but also periodic checks later on to improve and increase your security levels or customize them in individual very important ways. But weirdly, although between both of these brands they have attacked this particular subject with quite a lot of ferocity, I would argue that it's been made a great deal more simpler on the Synology side, and although it is a great deal more broad and there are significantly more tools on the QNAP side, a lot of them are optional. Now, if we start on the Synology side, we can head over into the Security Advisor. This is installed by default. You can go ahead and choose whether you're going to use it for home or business. And again, there's a checklist for you to go through where you can identify what things you want done, but most people will go ahead and assign themselves an identity as a home or business user. So if we go for a home user, for example, it will immediately scan the system and its architecture and configure that severity of its scans dependent on you, the end user. So, for example, it's checking, have any of my passwords weak and crackable, of which one of them is. Have I got any apps that are out of date, which apparently I do. It's checking my network there. If I'm using remote access without an SSL certificate, it will highlight it there. Ultimately, it's now scanning the whole system and finding out where potential vulnerabilities can live. And then from there, if you choose, you can do more advanced scanners where you can change the preset parameters as well as the regularity of scheduled scans to let you know if and when things need attention. And indeed, you can create reports if you choose, which can then be accessible when you need them, as well as get them via email if you choose. So it's a nice little setup there on the Synology side that's quite straightforward and easy. And as you can see, it's stating that one of my packages is out of date and I do have a weak password there. So again, these are things I can attend to very easily from here, and it will allow me to view the nature of that issue and go about how to change it. And there, as you can see, although the admin account's been deactivated, I've still got that primary account there. So it's quite straightforward. I would argue it's kept the simplicity of security checks, and there are some tools that are kept as optional. So for example, if we go into the all packages area there, and again, we can sort by a number of different things, but again, things like antivirus are an optional extra. And there's other things that you can do for just controlling the device there in the background and, locking the device up that are optional. But the baseline application there is pretty deep and gives you a lot to cover there. Now, on the QNAP side, they have more tools. They really do. But at the same time, those tools, most of them are optional. So, for example, the malware removal tool is included. So with this tool, it will periodically scan the data for malware, which should not be confused with ransomware. They're actually quite different things. Now, as you can see, it's now going to periodically scan the system. You can do a non-stop scan or a scheduled scan, as well as alter the alerts you receive if things need your attention. But if we go into the App Center, we're going to find a lot more different applications available to us for security. So, for example, if we click the security tab down here at the bottom, we're able to see that we can install McAfee for antivirus. We can install QFirewall, which is a dedicated firewall management tool, something the Synology doesn't have, but the Synology has general network overview. So again, it gives you these things, but QNAP gives you more diverse and more configurable tools, but at the same time, they're optional and they can be quite intimidating. So we'll get to that in a moment. And finally, QNAP's own security counselor, which is a great deal more diverse in its utility, the things it covers and scans for, and it's just a broader, bigger tool for managing lots of things. So I don't understand why QNAP have made it an optional app. That should be installed by default in the same way that Synology have their security advisor installed by default. And given things that have happened in the past with regards to network and data security over the years, I think it's very strange that Security Counselor is not a default app straight off the bat there. Now, I touched on that there earlier on, and we will come back into that application in a moment, but network management. In a moment, we will talk about network management, but that will be for another video, so don't worry. But suffice to say, the network management between Synology and QNAP is tremendously different. And once again, the QNAP there, which does throw a lot of information at you, does manage to do it, if we put this into advanced mode. Even in beginner mode, it's quite advanced, with the system giving you so many ways to manage and create those virtual networks on the system that on the Synology are just a lot more dumbed down. Now, a lot of home users are probably going to like that, but more network savvy and teched up tool guys are probably going to find this ever so slightly limiting. It is user friendly, it is responsive, and it's made like this for a reason, but the configuration on that QNAP is just that little bit deeper. It's just a shame that a lot of these things you have to dig to find or are presented to you in quite an advanced way. But let's wait until the finish of the installation of those security tools there, and then I'll walk you through them. So now the Security Advisor tool is completed, what we can do is go into it there as an overview for all the other security tools. You go in, and the first thing it's going to ask you is, do you want to go for a basic, intermediate or advanced security policy there? Bear in mind that by default it will do a basic, but you can also customize that quite rigorously. So if we go for a basic security for now, then go ahead and scan immediately, what it will do is now run our initial scan there of the system to find where the vulnerabilities are with regard to the network and the passwords, just like before. But on top of that, what we can do is see that the antivirus tab has now appeared, the malware remover tab has appeared, and the QFirewall tab has appeared because we installed those tools. So again, from the antivirus, if we choose, we can activate the antivirus tool to create the scheduled scans utilizing the antivirus software there. So if we choose, we can scan all folders if we choose, call it test 1. Go ahead, click next. How often do we want it? So we're going to say every 24 hours, click next. Do we want to scan specific areas or the whole system? Then from there, remove that from the screen. And then from there, do we want to overlook certain files or dig very, very deep? For that, I'm going to let it carry on. Do you want it to report things or immediately quarantine or immediately remove things that are suspect? You can tick that. And there you go. It's now got our scheduled job being created there for the antivirus tool. While it creates that there in the background, we can head back into the antivirus tool and next look at the malware remover. Again, we can run that scan directly from here without going into the app. And finally, we can go to QFirewall. And from QFirewall, you can get the system to adapt and change itself based on where you are in the world and your own network settings. And it will go ahead and change the firewall security protocol depending on your own setup there. Again, if you don't know what you're doing, leave these things as default and it will maintain and slam the doors down. And then later on, individual applications, if you need to create remote access, you can then start looking into your router. But again, make sure you know what you're doing before you start playing with those settings. As you can see, the 2 gig of memory inside this system has slowed things down, which is really annoying. And one of the things we have noticed before, yes, this system has 2 gig of memory and the Synology has 4 gig of memory, but the Synology is not using that much memory, and you do tend to find that the Synology does a slightly better job of internal caching. So even though we are using 2 very, very different systems here, it should be highlighted that despite that, it is clear that the QNAP QTS platform doesn't do quite the same level of intelligent caching as the Synology side, but at the same time presents a greater deal of information and customization throughout its setup there, as we see more and more of the system resources getting used with all of the different things we're running there in the background. So if we head back in, we can see with QFirewall, we can go ahead and create our profile there. So we're going to go with the basic protection as mentioned earlier on. We say which region we're in, so in my case, United Kingdom. From there, click next, and it will enable that firewall for our region and with those allocated prerequisite settings there. So there we go. While it's doing all of that, we're now going to have our firewall created. We've got the antivirus there in the background getting ready and being set up, as you can see there with that job that we've created there, our test job that we can scan manually now if we choose. And on top of that, we have got the security check up there that's now been performed, and we can view that report. And again, we can see where it suggests things that can be changed, what needs to be altered, where the vulnerabilities may lie, such as the password mentioned earlier on, or that some apps need to be updated. So again, There's lots of configuration options there, and if we choose, we can create our own bespoke security policy where you can go through every single check on this system over time. Again, it's a lot of information to be thrown at you there, but it's still going to be quite useful to be able to create a more bespoke network setup if you are intending to run a very unique network configuration there. But once again, between these two systems, time and time again, what we find is on the QNAP side, it's presenting us with a greater deal of information all the time. And on the Synology side, it's trying to keep things as chewable and friendly as possible, with all those things being done in the background where appropriate. There are still tools that are just not available on the Synology side that are on the QNAP side, but it's whether you use them or not. Finally, let's end things on just a few tips before we end this part of this series of videos. Straight away, one of the things you might want to know about is installing an SSL certificate on your NAS. If you intend to access your NAS regularly, via remote level means, or you're going to be using different devices, then it can always be handy to take advantage of an SSL certificate, with both of these devices allowing you to go ahead and replace the certificate you arrive with an encrypted remote access one from Let's Encrypt. Again, you can go ahead and download them directly. You will have to sign up and create an account, but it's nice and straightforward, very easily and largely done, so SSL knows who the certificate is being assigned to. Again, you can add them very easily, and both platforms support Let's Encrypt. Again, that's a completely free certificate if you need it. Also, if you want to enable two-step authentication, both of these devices allow you at the top corner there to personalize your account, and then from there enable two-step authentication, with Synology having not only support of OTP and you know, like Google Authenticate and stuff like that, but they've also got their own. But both of these platforms arrive with support of two-step authentication very, very easily there. When it comes to creating shared folders for your data, both of these platforms allow you to go into the File Station File Explorer, and then from there click Create, click click Create Shared Folder. From there you can go ahead and create a folder. We'll call this one Share 2. From there you can put a recycle bin if you choose. You can encrypt that if you choose. So although you can't encrypt the whole volume yet like you can on the QNAP, you can at least encrypt the shared folder. From there you can choose whether you want to take advantage of checksums and data checks thanks to BTRFS, as well as creating limitations of file size if you like. Finally, from there you can go ahead and create your shared folder easily. On the QNAP side there, if you want to create a shared folder, go there, click Shared Folder, give it a name, Share 2. Again, add a comment, no need. Which volume is it going to live on? There's our big volume. Do you want to assign it a specific path? Do you want to encrypt it? Click Next. From there, which users do you want to have access to it? You can select them there. Next. From there, there's a lot more configuration options here on the QNAP to allow you to create certain support towards. You configure it so it is the designated folder for an Apple Time Machine backup. Allow it to take advantage of SMB encryption if you're going to be taking advantage of that. On top of that, whether you want to hide it on the local area network rather than it being visible like any other. There's lots of different options there, as well as letting guests access it, yes or no. From there, you'll create your new shared folder. On the Synology side, as you can see now, it's asking who can have access to it, so we let just that person access it, and that's it. But once again, it is just that slight bit faster there on the Synology, thanks to that intelligent background caching, and just the system just being a little bit more streamlined there. Once again, we are talking about two different hardware architecture NASs here, although both of them are 64-bit x86 processors. Let's summarize what we've learned today. We've covered setting these devices up for the first time, how they compare, which options are open to you, where it's user-friendly and where it sometimes isn't. Ultimately, between these two devices, it is going to be about the customization versus simplicity, and I hope part one of this series has really shown you just how different these two brands are in the way information is portrayed, as well as their utility and how you use them. Arguably, the Synology is more straightforward, but the QNAP is definitely more customizable, although that customization certainly comes with a few little bumps and hurdles that you may have to jump over along the way. Look forward to part 2 in this series, where we look at SSD applications on here, the creation of virtual storage, creating iSCSI targets, mapped shared folders, and more, as we talk about more advanced storage applications on these two devices and how they compare, and hopefully help you decide decide which is best for you. Stay tuned for part 2. If you've enjoyed this, there should be guides linked below, as well as the setup guides that I mentioned earlier on. You can link to find out more about setting these devices up from scratch that goes straight into the software and more. Stay tuned for those, check those out. More parts coming soon. Thank you so much for watching. Click like and subscribe. Links in the description to find out more, and I'll see you next time.